Najprej bi se rad zahvalil vsem, ki so prispevali tako ali drugače v organizaciji tega dogodka, primarno kolegici Magdaleni Cvetkovi, ki je poskrbela za logistiko organizacije, potem prodekanu Sačka Rešetu, ki nekako upam, da ni nepravilna beseda, ker je sodelka za zgodovino pokrovitelj, beseda pokrovitelj tega dogodka in krovni, recimo, koordinator dnevov znanstvenega inštituta Filozofske fakultete, se pravi, to je tudi prilika, v katero se umešča današnji dogodek, današnje predavanje, se pravi del proslave oziroma cikla dogodkov o dnevu inštituta Filozofske fakultete, tako da, če se niste ogledali drugih, je jutri še nekaj priložnosti, da boste programu, pišete še kakšen drug dogodek v tem sklopu. Potem seveda zahvala Marku Bauerju z realizacijo, ker je prevedel to knjigo in pomagal organizirati. Hvala Urošu Zormanu, ker je prinesel danes te knjige, ki jih lahko kupite po zniženi ceni, se pravi po akcijski ceni 25 €. Se pravi, to je knjiga našega predavatelja z naslovom Kuda, odlična knjiga, da ste se prebrali na poved, ker ne bom zdaj ponavljal, ampak super knjiga, recimo, če še ne veste, lahko pridete, preberete na drugi strani. Na drugi strani sinopsis, lahko pa kupite tudi te izvrstne kape, ki jih je oblikoval Jaka Neon, tako da še Jaki Neonu zahvala tudi za 25 €, tako da se lažje zapomnim. Ni skupnega okusta žal za nekaj čist tehničnih težav oziroma računovodskih težav. Sprav to, a sem še koga izkusil, hvala Tanji Veladič, urednici Sofije, ker je pač vodila na ravni cilje založbe prevod knjige Kuda. Seveda, hvala gostu, Bernardu Geogheganu, ker je nocoj z nami. Spravi, I'll now introduce you by affiliation. Bernard Geoghegan is currently at the Göteborgu University in Sweden, teaching at Göteborgu, but is in the middle of moving to Oslo University, so moving across Scandinavia, but he studied in the US, was teaching in London in between. He's a media theorist, historian of technology. So this is his most widely cited, influential, most widely discussed book, Code. This translation of this book is also the reason he's here tonight, but he will not talk about his book, but he will talk about Lacan, like situation appropriate or city appropriate or region appropriate. Not just about Lacan, he changed his synopsis a couple of times. So I'm reading the newest one. So the new title is the other Lacan, from the signifying change to the stochastic change. So the basic idea of the talk is two parts. The first part is to get a sense of another Lacan, overlooked by traditional theory. And the second sense is also to imagine token prediction technologies such as the large language models, as in a certain sense Lacanian, as in embodying certain principles laid out by Lacan in his technocratic moment and only realized today. So it's my great pleasure that this is not just a turn of phrase, it is a turn of phrase, but not just, because I think this will be a very, very important contribution to the overlooked part of French theorist reception in Ljubljana. So now giving you the floor, so now the talk, then discussion.
So thank you for the generous introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. Like not only my book, but have merchandise, my book, which I've never had at an event before. Extremely grateful to Primož and to Marco for, really, being first and foremost like readers of the book, and thereby making this event possible, right? The only reason to kind of read and the only reason to write and talk is, sort of just be engaged in a dialogue or a conversation. So the opportunity to not just have this book translated, but also to be here addressing you is a huge honor. I'm also grateful to the faculty for sponsoring me. So one of the things when we met yesterday, like I mentioned this idea, that one of the key ideas of Lacan was a return to Freud, right? And the idea of the return to Freud was he wanted to make Freud shocking. Like, the idea was one had a sort of received, somewhat cliched vision of Freud by the middle of the 20th century, one that he thought was rather safe, and without the kind of provocation that's sort of essential to understanding anything what psychoanalysis is all about. So the Stockings were in a very similar sort of spirit, right? A return to Freud, but also a return to Lacan, with the purpose not simply of reiterating what's well summarized in the text, but actually to capture some of the genuine, shocking, bizarre, often discomforting aspects of the work. So it's kind of with that spirit that I wrote this talk today. It's inspired, among other things, a quote from Lacan in Seminar 2, where he said, "The most complicated machines are made only with words." A token, many of us have learned in the last few years, is a basic unit of value in a large language model. It is to generative AI what, for example, a phoneme is to structural linguistics. What's interesting about a token is it can be a few letters, it can be a word, it can be a sentence. In principle, it could be an entire paragraph or a book. So for tokenization, it's not inherently a question of the meaningfulness or the size of an individual unit, but if it can be treated as an element within a larger system of interrelating elements. Now the basic principle of tokenization, which is these elementary units that strung together in a series have a certain amount to predict what's going to come next. They come out of Claude Chan's theory of information. So the mathematical theory of communication in the 1940s showed that there's invisible probabilities governing most communicative acts. Right now there's statistics that's, can predict how likely I am to I articulate the, in the rest of my sentence. That's very mathematically predictable. This same thing that makes the and its recurrence within a certain sort of English speaker predictable is also what allows tokens to become predictable elements that can string together entire statements from a large language model. And so, Shannon was interested in how you more efficiently engineer systems and can transmit signals more efficiently when you know what's predictable. Then you can kind of economize the signal. Large language models sort of flipped it upside down to not just more efficiently encode pre-existing text, but actually predict texts that have not been written. Now, as I've sort of suggested, tokens, rather like Saussurian phonemes, are defined not in terms of their inherent meaningfulness, but instead according to differential signification, produced by co-articulation. So the breakthrough of large language models consists in no small part in developing a means to more or less scale tokens up and down, almost infinitely, to deal with larger or smaller elements to predict different types of phenomena. So, one could imagine, in a kind of highly speculative science fiction view of the future, you could imagine historians of the future treating entities of the present, such as the European Union, climate change, the Russian Federation, and the US invasion of Iran, as kind of tokens interacting in some sort of planetary system. Right? And if these interaction elements can suggest what's going to come next, then they have some value as tokens. Now, with this ground cleared, in a very preliminary way, I'd like to get to the subject of the talk today. The tokenization of the psyche from around 1895 to 2026. In other words, my talk concerns the remaking of the human mind and its elements as discrete, quantified values in a distributed network that fashions the best, most likely path from token A to B to C on the fly. This concept I hope to show, had early and decisive formulation by Sigmund Freud in his project for scientific psychology, drafted in 1895, which defined the brain in terms of so-called cathectic energies that transformed experiences into economical pathways for predictable reactivation in the future around problem solving. In the 1950s, Jacques Lacan adapted Freud's suggestions to the then novel findings in cybernetics, game theory, information theory, and computing, to transpose Freud's thesis to what Lacan would call chains of signifiers, which became the new kind of predictable elements playing a role similar to what Lacan said was happening with signifier synapses and contact barriers in the brain. Part of Lacan's intervention, of course, was to not only deal with what's happening in the brain, but to suggest chains of signifiers extend outside the head, to include our environment, our peers, a larger set of contexts. And hence the intervention of the analyst is partly to become part of this chain of signifiers and make decisive interventions and cuts in the flow of, more or less predictable signals. Now, decisive for our purposes today, Freud's intuitions, which became Lacan's explicit theses, found loose articulation in the contemporaneous writings of Claude and Shannon before their decisive realization in Paul Verbos's 1974 PhD thesis, Beyond Regression, New Tools for Prediction and Analysis in the Behavioral Sciences, submitted to the Department of Mathematics at Harvard University. Verbos, in this thesis, applied Freud's theory from 1895 to the, according to Verbos, the goal was to adapt Freud to cybernetics to come up with learning algorithms. That's what Verbos said he was trying to do. So, in this kind of adaptation of the 1895 project to the design of a neural network that learned by treating elementary units of value, he came up with a way that you could essentially have the neurons given floating values, numerical values, that basically reflected how much resistance they gave to energy signals that were modified, and so the algorithm would go back through previous sorts of ways in the neuron to solve new problems. It would follow the path that was sort of had the least resistance. If it ended up with a wrong answer, it would adapt the flows on the fly, the same as Freud suggested contact barriers and synapses would adapt their resistance on the fly, so that in the future, it could predict a better answer to a new problem, right? So I'm going to explain some of this a little bit more explicitly, but Verbos's innovation here was to take stochastic chains, right? Semi-predictable statistical series as the model for understanding how you make these better predictions and adjust weights. That is today, it's called backpropagation, and it's a basic learning algorithm behind all language models. When language models predict one thing after the other, they're implementing a theory of mind based explicitly on Freud's theory of drive, cathexis, memory, and so on. Now, the title of my talk today, The Other Lacan, From Signifying Chains to Stochastic Chains, has in mind something about a different apprehension of what Lacan was up to that can fit within this history so perfectly. It also has in mind the prominence of fields such as information theory and cybernetics, and their leading practitioners, which in the 1950s and the 1960s constituted a sort of impossible ideal for Lacan. Not like an abstract zeitgeist thing, as in he was reading them, right? He discussed them as the rise of something called the conjectural sciences. Science is based on predicting where a certain entity will emerge based on a statistical flow of statistical play of differential signs and signifiers. Game theory does this very explicitly. Game theory, you set up a model for a problem and you kind of predict how things play out. Lacan said this is what's happening in information theory today, it's what's happening in cybernetics, it's what's happening in structural linguistics, and he says this is the task of psychoanalysis today, right? So, when I say the other Lacan, part of what I have in mind is actually something like the other of Lacan, right? Which, to a certain extent, was this great, huge technocratic project to come up with not merely better machines, but this entirely radical new way of organizing the flow of signs and signals. And, you know, if we take Verbos's project for back propagation seriously, the organization of things like libido, according to what Lacan calls the conjectural sciences based on the mathematical analysis, prediction, and what Lacan lays the least emphasis on, management of that signal, right? So it's the other of Lacan in part because these fields are implemented with far greater exactitude and precision, something that Lacan can sort of only conjure up in evocative terms. I don't think we've exactly written this history of Lacan, nor have we really grasped the manner in which the Lacan we know depends on another structural psychoanalytic entity, which is essentially the rise of cybernetics and information theory that today goes by the name of the large language model. Indeed, I mean, I would say if one wants to find the legacy of Lacanianism today, if one wants to find its beating heart, where its premises and principles, and among other things, as that its provocations are most active, I think one would do better to look at ChatGPT or Gemini than to look at psychoanalytical practitioners in Buenos Aires or Paris. Now, let's get into the history of it. In 1957, information theorist Claude Shannon received 66 suicide notes from the US Postal Service. The notes were sorted into pairs, each pair consisting of a genuine suicide note and a fake suicide note. He hadn't asked for this. This is just appeared in his mailbox. And the genuine and the fake note were both composed by people of the same gender, the same ethnicity, the same class background, and otherwise occupying a certain sort of comparable subject position. The letters have been compiled by a clinical psychologist at the Veterans Administration Neuropsychiatric Clinic, Hospital I should say, of Los Angeles. The researchers' hope in sending these to Shannon unsolicited was that Shannon, celebrated for identifying statistical patterns of data transmission in his landmark essay, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, could likewise identify statistical patterns operating outside human consciousness that distinguish the writing of the pathological from the non-pathological authors. What's the kind of distinct signature in these letters that shows who's the genuinely suicidal person? The purpose of this was prediction. If you could do that, in the future, psychiatrists and similar persons would be able to look at the writings of their patients and understand who's going to really kill themselves versus who's having something like an idle ideation. Now this sounds like a very, this is not what Claude Shannon is known for today. And it sounds completely, he was a famous communication engineer at Bell Labs, and then a famous professor of communication engineering at MIT. That's what he's known for. But to give you an idea of how typical this was of what was happening at the moment, and this is also in a sense to say how, in a way, actually, in this respect, very unremarkable Lacan's projects were in the 1950s. The year prior, Shannon had been offered a permanent research position at a distinguished psychiatric clinic on the East Coast in the United States, where it was hoped he would do work like this. They would basically give him permanent tenure at a psychiatric clinic in the hopes that he could apply cybernetics, information theory, to the diagnosis of what's going on with patients who, you know, particularly when dealing with schizophrenics, but not only, produce very complicated, scrambled communications. Now, the person who sent him this letter did not know he had just been offered that job. It's just that's what people were turning towards cybernetics and information theory all the time. Now, it's tempting to look at this as some kind of intemperate enthusiasm for new media of the day, right? As you know, right now there's a certain kind of enthusiasm for large language models, this idea that they can kind of maybe do anything. That's not exactly what's happening here. Like, it's not just some unmitigated, like, techno-solutionism. What we're dealing with are much more durable economic, institutional, and political forces which were driving the search for technological solutions to social management. Okay? The search for technological solutions for social management is not technological. It's political, right? It's a social and political idea of how you solve and manage dilemmas like madness. But the notion that you can do that with technology doesn't come from the technology. It comes from a political program, right? Technocracy. So for example, just to set these things in, what's the political and social problem of management that brings this project, that brings these letters to Shannon's door? Well, the VA hospital, of course, the Veterans Hospital, it's a federal institution for soldiers, not at all insignificant. It's the place where much of the most cutting-edge research was happening, not insignificant either. And the Veterans Administration, Veterans Administration hospital sprung up all over the United States in the 10 years or so after World War II, because you had such tremendous demand for mental health care. You had such rate of neuroses and violence and mental disturbance among soldiers coming home from World War II that it was deemed politically necessary to come up with a chain of institutions for managing their illnesses. I'll mention in passing, this was also closely linked to there was an idea at the time, finding people like Adorno, that fascism was the result of overly brittle societies where a lack of proper methods of social adjustment drives something like a collective madness that leads to unbelievable violence. So it's the effort to manage, to invent, you know, hundreds of hospitals for tens of thousands of patients, maybe hundreds of thousands of patients. It's not for the patients alone, right? It's to keep America a liberal democracy. This is like, you can read the project proposals. It's not like a paranoid theory. It also took place against another context, which is that in the same period, more like the 1930s and 1940s, you had a huge influx of psychoanalysts and psychiatrists from Europe to North America. Many of them were Jewish. They were often feared to be potentially communists. Many of them also had an association with Eastern and Central Europe. And so this idea, sciences of the mind, people helping you think differently that are Jewish and coming from Europe, there was a concern that this would be a destabilizing force in American life. So the development of all these hospitals, and among other things, the emphasis on coming up with techniques drawn from engineering, drawn from hard sciences, drawn from cybernetics and information theory, was ostensibly, the purpose was to have neutral political mechanisms, non-partisan solutions to what were social problems like madness, that among other things would cut off at the knees the influence of European psychiatry and European psychoanalysis. which is deemed, among other things, a subversive threat to the nation. Now, these projects, it's hard to explain how well funded these programs were and how transformative they were. To mention people associated with them, Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead, Irving Goffman, many of the leading social scientists of the period spent some time working in clinics, often with schizophrenic patients. That was a favorite category. Developing these technical applications to manage mental unwellness according to engineering techniques that really took shape during World War II. And I'll just mention in passing, that's the context in which people first started reading Foucault in the United States, right? So this very progressive set of practitioners of the mental sciences, people with training in fields like sociology and anthropology, who were flooding the mental hospitals, they knew there was this kind of, by the 60s, they were aware that there was this, late 60s, they were aware that this incredible new thinker in France who was practicing what was said to be a kind of structural analysis of the longue durée histories of madness. And madness was no longer just some eruption from within the head, right? But it had larger systems and logics that could be mapped, which fit exactly squarely with, I wouldn't say exactly, it's very complementary to the spirit of what the US government was trying to implement and what people like Bateson and Mead were developing in these hospitals. Okay. So, as Primoz mentioned, my book Code, now translated, explores, among other things, the fallout of these transformations in post-war France. So under forces like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Marshall Plan, and the CIA, who were all funding research in post-war France, there was an effort to shift the scholarship of Francophone scholars, French-speaking scholars, particularly in the social sciences and the human sciences, towards technical methods that were less speculative, right? This was, and when they said speculative, the great part of their abhorrence, right? These programs' abhorrence for essentially European social sciences, European social theory, was they thought the speculative dimension of social scientific thought, among other things, was more sympathetic to political revolution. And if you can train people to learn by the facts and by the numbers and by measurement with machines, the idea was they could create more stable political subjects. And if you're training scientists in these methods, then you can create a more stable society. That's the basic premise. And so under that same premise, that in the same period, again with lots of funding from organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation, France started setting up places like, they called this Institut des Sciences Sociales. So programs that advance higher education in the social sciences, which among their chief goals is to train what will be kind of administrators of a massively expanding de Gaulleist technocratic French state. Right? Now, so we have a couple of things going on at once. We have this moment in the present where I'm saying, okay, the people who built language models, they were building them up, the early work was built on Freud, and it closely paralleled what was what was happening with Lacanu. You see someone like Shannon, and then a whole bunch of other researchers that are being pulled into psychiatric research for more or less political reasons, and technical research is supposed to stabilize society. I'm suggesting to you that there's a close link here, a privileged link to psychoanalysis. The historiography of large language models, of computing, of cybernetics, and I would probably say the historiography of psychoanalysis rejects this affiliation. In the classical historiography, and like if you just read the essays of computer scientists in the 1950s and the 1960s, science in the 1960s and 1950s in the United States was closely allied with analytical philosophy and with cognitive science. Analytical philosophy had this notion that reason came about through thinking with logical symbols. And so early theorists of artificial intelligence tried to adapt Wittgenstein's Tractatus volume to a system of programming symbol processing in so-called symbolic AI machines, right? And at the same time, cognitive science, among other things, history is complicated, I'm simplifying it a little bit. Cognitive science similarly favored, at the time, part of the reason you had a science of cognition was because the notion was that cognition was scientific, meaning you're rational, predictable, orderly. And so that's why they're so obsessed in the 1950s and 1960s with building chess machines. Chess machines are the ideal model of reason. And it corresponds to a certain way of thinking about reason that maps onto analytical philosophy, cognitive science, and theory. So the question is, sort of everything I'm saying would seem to sort of be undermined by the standard way we talk about the history of artificial intelligence. Well, things are a little more complicated. Okay. The first thing to note, okay, so there was, between 1950 and around 1970, there was a huge boom in artificial intelligence research that all crashed in the 1970s. And the reason it crashed is because all of the hyped up research in AI in the 1950s and 1960s was a failure. They couldn't build any of the systems they wanted to build. They spent a lot of unbelievable amounts of money, they had unbelievable amounts of computation, and the results were close to zero. It's because they were relying on analytical philosophy and cognitive science. The theory of mind they had, for most intents and purposes, was a wrong theory of mind. We don't solve problems with top-down reasoning tree structures. That's not how people deal with problems. Like observe yourself going through the day, and there's really not a top-down logical this or that program. So to be sure, the dominant historiography is correct, but they're correct insofar as that was the reason that artificial intelligence, as it existed, was a huge failure. But the other aspect to it is that some of these researchers I mentioned, people like Claude Shannon, or people like Norbert Wiener, they had a model of intelligence in machines that was completely irreconcilable with the symbolic AI program. Okay? Among other things, it was extremely enamored of psychoanalysis, and its model of problem solving was statistical. The idea is that you deal with problem solving is based on encountering a complex situation with more variables than you can really map, and your brain develops a way of kind of weighing on the fly, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, I'm going to do this, I'm going to follow that route. This model of problem solving, which is a model that's driven by statistics, is not logical in anything like the same way that symbolic AI is. It was an object of constant discussion. It was rejected by the mainstream researchers who said it was unreasonable. So just to kind of tease this out a little bit. So Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics, writes in his book of the same name, published in 1948, quote, "The technique of the psychoanalyst consists in a series of means to discover and interpret hidden memories, to make the patient accept them for what they are, and by their acceptance modify, if not their content, at least the effective tone they carry, and thus make them less harmful. All of this is perfectly consistent with the view of cybernetics." And then he has a whole chapter based on how you shouldn't modify the unwell by giving them lobotomies. You should modify them by working at the level of signals and relays. That's where mental illness lies. He finds this truth in psychoanalysis. He does not find it in, say, mechanical approaches to subtraction. So, what Wiener's approach did, what it argued essentially, was the operative site of reasoning, and at the very least, the operative site of mental illness, was what engineers call coding. And specifically, coding errors. Coding is the method by which you relay signals back and forth. Coding is essentially conceived of, like if you know Morse code, E's take very little, and a Z takes up long, because the code is devised to economically transmit the signal and also to avoid errors. Things that are used all the time are either economical or, if they're really important, they're coded in a way that resists confusion. So coding, and of course, as you know Morse code, coding is not semantic. It's not in the first instance about meaning. It's about the efficiency of relaying signals. And so when someone like Wiener is suggesting, again and again and again, mental illness is effectively a coding error, such as is described in psychoanalysis. He's arguing for a turn away from semantics towards what, in the human sciences in the same period, is becoming known as signifiers. Right? The little envelope that gets the signal from here to there. And of course, the thing is, if you think about it, okay, whatever the meanings are of what I'm saying to you right now, like, they're not very predictable. And a language model cannot predict the meaning of anything I'm going to say. Right? It can predict elements and units of words. It can predict sentences. It can predict, essentially, it can reconstruct the code, but it doesn't operate on meaning because it's not particularly quantifiable. Right? So when we're talking about code, that's what we're talking about. Effectively, the material trace that defines an act of communication. Okay. Now, while the effort to treat intelligence as a problem of coding never dominated 1950s research on artificial intelligence, it did, as I say, wildly excite researchers such as Shannon and Wiener. And if you look across the theory, they start theorizing neural networks. They start theorizing problem solving and learning in terms of coding things according to specific values. And usually the reference, sometimes it's explicit, more often it's implicit, is for the 1895 Project for Scientific Psychology, which I mentioned above, which has this model of how it is that neurons in the brain are charged with different quantities of energy with different numerical values, and then adapted to different rates, different values according to problem solving. And essentially they're saying, this is a good way of understanding what happens when a machine is trying to learn a problem and is trying to develop experiences and then revisit them. So the idea they have, effectively, that they're taking from Freud, is that neurons basically organize in dynamic relays. They have contact barriers. These contact barriers adapt relative resistance. The word Freud uses is Widerstand, electrical resistance, which is also the term that communication engineers like Shannon and Wiener are using. They're looking at the resistance to signals, only they're dealing with vacuum tubes and so on. And this whole process channels or suppresses further relays to produce what's ultimately supposed to be a pleasurable release of energy. Right? So the idea is there's a kind of, Freud doesn't have the word that cyberneticians have. The cyberneticians have this word homeostasis. Homeostasis is when all the signals in the system are balanced and self-perpetuating. Freud says that energy builds up, it goes, kind of floods through the neurons of the brain, and you don't want pent-up energy. So it needs to find a release, which the cyberneticians rather, in this case rather correctly, interpret as a search for homeostasis. Right? And when they suggest that mental illness results from a certain blockage of energy, they're really not that far from Freud at all. Now keep in mind, I should say this clearly, these people are not good readers of Freud. Like, that's not the point, right? The point is they're trying to build a particular type of system, and like, the reason people return to Freud again and again is he has these wonderful models that are incredibly operational and plausible. And so the thing was, somebody had already thought, how do you explain an ideal economic, mechanical function of thinking? He mapped it out. The question is not necessarily if it's literally accurate. The question was it a good diagram? Shannon and Wiener said, yes, this is the best thing we have. And logic is not. Now, anticipating much of Freud's later work on the unconscious, and in essence like the mystic writing pattern, this whole approach to thinking of memory in terms of quantities of energy effectively puts to the side questions of meaning and semantics. It fragments, and he doesn't say like there's no neuron in your brain for the. There's no neuron in your brain for mama. Like, it's rather it takes all of these different signals and traces and splits them up into many, many pieces. And those pieces' significance is their ability to relay the signal more or less efficiently. Semantics, meaning, operates on a relatively low hierarchy. And then, particularly in subsequent years, as you start introducing things like the unconscious and a kind of logic of inscriptions, some of which are visible and non-visible, Freud effectively radicalizes this break from meaning such that you get a theory of the mind in which something like reason, cognition, meaning looks more like a cover story than a driver of action. Again, entirely different from how cognitive science explains learning. There's obviously many cognitive science, the dominant term of the period. Now, if we take the case of Shannon, it's not clear how closely someone like Shannon read Freud, or if he actually read Freud at all, or just absorbed it because it was in the air. But he does write about Freud, and in an unpublished manuscript titled Brains, Minds, and Machines, authored in the late 1950s, Shannon sought to translate Freudian theory into cybernetic terms, explaining concisely that, quote, most of the things that humans do can be thought of as something that will balance a servo or bring a certain effect about. So, a servo is a servo mechanism. It's a real-time mechanical system for adapting a signal to maintain balance, right? So in Shannon's interpretation, the goal of psychoanalysis was to effectively improve the operation of the servos, to make sure that energy doesn't build up, that it's properly relayed, economically relayed. And psychoanalysis does this not least of all by channeling backed up relays, this is what he writes, I'm paraphrasing, through the benevolent means of the psychoanalyst. So the signals no longer just are bouncing around the head, the signals jump the body, and they start moving through someone with whom you're having a dialogue. So according to Shannon, what this does is it frees up the signal, it unblocks the signal, and allows the patient to recover from suffering that at its core is based on a whole system of repression that's keeping the energy inside. So Shannon proposed that, quote, this is Shannon writing, according to Freud's doctrines, many of the common psychoses and neuroses are due to repression and damming up of sexual and other natural desires. Psychoanalysis claims to cure these people by bringing the repression out into the open. The circuit is open, running through the output terminals of the brain and into the psychoanalyst. End quote. So we have a couple of points here I'd like to signal and what Shannon's taking away from psychoanalysis. First, he explicitly argues that for an analysis of the brain and analysis of computing, he argues for an analysis of brains and computing both in terms of libidinal economy that emphasizes systems error and
the problems of efficient signal relay. Second, successful treatment involves a reconfiguration of the circuits so that the codes, again, are tidied up, liberated, in part by extending them into an analyst who becomes an agent in their modification by linguistic exchange. This leads us specifically to Shannon's theory of language, developed in the same manuscript. Adapting basic tenets of information theory, he argues that we often mistake words like, his examples are like God and freedom and love. He says we mistake these as stable and meaningful reference, when all the findings of cybernetics and information theory indicate that they should be treated first and foremost as a series of arbitrary traces, interacting with other traces to construct a certain system of reasoning. So writing in terms that closely mirrored emerging discussions of the priority of the signifier, then current across the Atlantic, Shannon writes, quote, "These particular noises we call words are a little different from other noises in one important respect, that many brains are conditioned to react in fairly definite ways when these noises strike the ear." And he goes on to explain, in a sense, what we should really understand, words are at the core splotches of ink on a page. That is what the core of words are, and we want to explain their effects on mental illness. You want to explain how these material traces can change what's happening in the mind. You don't want to explain necessarily the meaning of these words. That's his argument. In many ways, it's much more radical than what Freud is up to, but you can certainly see how he's moving towards a certain, you think of like cybernetics information theory as being like immaterial, like, oh, it's just like data, and they're like, no, this is, everything is material traces, economically certain. Okay, let's jump forward. Shannon's work, Shannon's work along these lines, he discusses at conferences and with friends, but he never really publishes it and never becomes particularly popular. But the sets of ideas are not circulating because someone talked to someone and said this. They're dealing with technical systems where this is actually extremely, the affordance of the computing systems kind of lend themselves to this suggestion, and it matches a larger set of technocratic impulses. Which is why I point to you have similar ideas popping up in McCulloch and Pitts, and people like Wiener. Shannon just articulates them unusually well, and he's the person everyone else likes. Okay. Now let's get back to Paul Burroughs' 1974 dissertation, which I'm arguing for the purposes of today constitutes a huge kind of juncture in the history of the human sciences. Burroughs' accomplishment in this thesis was to establish a bridge between the so-called conjectural sciences, taking shape between conjectural sciences and Freud's 1895 project. It's in that thesis that he develops backpropagation, a way of calculating backwards and adjusting weights to free up the signal, based on the formalization of Freud's early energetic model of the neurons. And in this, Burroughs argues that feedback mechanisms have a potential to alter synaptic resistance in response to things like frustration. And so by treating the error signal in the brain as a problem of the buildup of energy in Freud's terms, he mathematizes in machines, he embodies in machines what's supposed to be drive, okay? But machines learn using this algorithm, and this algorithm is used very widely, not just in language models. It's supposed to be a drive that makes them want to solve the problem. It's built on a theory of the drive by Freud. I'm not saying machines have desires. Okay? What I'm saying is they're built on a model of desire suggested by Freud. Okay. So in this context, I'm not going to say a whole lot about Lacan, but I'm going to get back to the return to Freud. Okay. The brilliance of Lacan's intervention in the 1950s lies in large part in a clinical recognition that the machine was coming to recognize a new way of understanding the symbolic activity of the brain, and that this way was of decisive importance and could not be ignored. And he argues, among other things, you want to know why Freud had such good ideas? Because Hegel was here, Freud was here, and the machine pops up in the middle. And when he says machine, he's talking about industrial machines based on thermodynamics, which is to say feedback systems of flow that are ultimately governed by probability and statistics. And he says this is where Freud comes from. So in making this argument, he's making an extremely accurate argument about Freud. He's also interpreting Freud in terms of cybernetics and information theory, which are all based on models of things like entropy and signal relay, which Lacan was learning about, among other things, from people like Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roman Jakobson, who had close connections at MIT. So it appears, as far as we can tell, like, I wouldn't be surprised if Lacan was in the first 10 people to get a copy of Shannon's Mathematical Theory of Communication, because Roman Jakobson spoke to the publishers and said, you have to send this guy to Lacan, this text to Lacan. And so Lacan is very actively like reinterpreting Freud in these terms, but he's Lacan, he's interpreting in those terms because they're actually highly suggestive and generative, for reasons not so different as Channing and Wiener found them suggestive. It's also in this context, I think rather accurately, that Lacan makes this argument that what we're dealing with now in fields like psychoanalysis, but also fields like game theory, is a huge transformation in knowledge in modernity, right? A transition from exact sciences to so-called conjectural sciences. Science is based on figuring out when something appears amongst a play of interacting elements. So part of what when he returns to Freud, he is returning to Freud, right? But he's giving a Freud that never existed before. And he's based on, among other things, technical models coming from engineers at MIT, who, you know, among other things, were widely detested in much of France, certainly among the French left, associated with technocracy, associated with capitalism, associated with domination. So a lot of things are going on at once. And, you know, in a certain sense, Lacan names exactly what Freud does. And he names why Freud is so powerful for the engineers. Okay? Lacan increasingly comes to the argument, not just, you know, psychoanalytic mental illness, but the entire problem of human being emerges from the attempt to locate oneself in chains of signifiers that extend far beyond us. Right? Psychoanalysis is not about treating what's in your brain, it's treating your place within a structure of symbolic relays. So the year that Shannon is particularly writing so much about the symbolic, he defines the symbolic and its relationship to psychoanalysis. He explicitly founds it on Claude Shannon's theory of information. Hence, famously says the world of the symbolic is the world of the machine. And what he's doing is, he's de-anthropocentrizing psychoanalysis. He's freeing psychoanalysis and he's freeing language from its dependence on humans. Okay? He's showing that the core of psychoanalysis, in a sense, is a whole system of signals that are so formal and regular and predictable that they're actually best actualized in the labors of machines, not by humans. Humans are a very secondary relationship. Like, humans' relationship to the symbolic order, extremely messy. The only thing that holds it together is they're constantly taking recourse to some kind of imaginary identification to pull some systematicity out of it. This is the difference of machines. And Lacan's very aware of this, and he explains this. Machines don't need recourse to something imaginary to systematize the signal, the traces. In fact, the only thing they'll work with is the traces. And if they hit a gap, they'll either stop, or in contemporary machines, they'll hallucinate. Very different from what humans do. So, Lacan hits on this, essentially, like, this displacement of the ego, the displacement of the self, that at work in Freud, a new theory of language that's basically on chains of signifiers and communication, no longer about people talking to one another. And it's on that basis that he's doing this kind of incredible kind of adapting the situation of both problem psychoanalysis relative to the most contemporary sciences through a process of returning to Freud and making propositions that are patently outrageous, like totally outrageous. This is also the time that people like Merleau-Ponty are like lecturing the Collège de France. And Lacan's reading Merleau-Ponty very well, and can account for that too. But, you know, the birth of structuralism in people like Lacan, it's going completely against the grain of everything coming out of fields like phenomenology or existentialism. Their entire practice is also based on working in research seminars. So the research seminar is a different way of learning from the kind of philosophy salon. The philosophy salon, you sit around and discuss ideas and you think, you have some question of like human challenges and struggles. At the seminars run by Lacan, and run by Lévi-Strauss, and run by Jacobson, and Lévi-Strauss effectively founds this model in post-war France. Experts come together with technical language, technical jargon. They do stuff like Lacan would do. They use sometimes completely inscrutable mathematical analyses. They do things like Lévi-Strauss reduces primitive mythology to algebraic equations. And on that basis, they say we've got a description of this rationalized system, right? And, you know, you start to see why, to me, like, again, the political project that brings these sciences to the fore in the United States, and it's also associated with promoting and funding their development in France, is not a neutral one, right? This notion that mental illness or problems of one of the things that would happen to you is problems of race relations, that they were not about social conflict, but they're about maladjustment, a lack of homeostasis. It strips away the political core that, you know, constitutes a great deal of mental illness. And it suggests we're going to define this problem and solve this problem by being a little bit more like experts and technicians. And Lacan's, I would not say Lacan's a technocrat, but his seminars are the spirit of 1950s technocracy, in many respects. I'm going to slowly move towards a conclusion. Now, Paul Verboes never reads Geoghegana. That's not really the point here, right? What's interesting is actually Lacan articulates what Paul Verboes figures out, because they're both operating on this terrain of the conjectural sciences, of a new way of problem solving. And so Paul Verboes' formalization of backpropagation, like Lacan's psychoanalysis, breaks with romantic interiority of the unconscious, and it reconstitutes the Freudian subject as distributive stochastic apparatus. This rigorous resonance with Lacan between a kind of mid-century structuralist return to Freud and the mathematical rediscovery of the 1895 project by Verboes reveals how, in a way, Lacan and Verboes, who never met, who never knew each other, were nonetheless co-conspirators in an effort to adapt psychoanalytic legacies to technocratic infrastructures that, among other things, demanded mathematization of desire and the management of an excessive abundance of communications that was characteristic of 20th century life. And if you go, Lacan in Seminar 2, particularly in, if you look at the original discussion of the seminar on the Prologue letter, it's based on a set of machines designed by Shaman and Hagelbard that show how our choices are structured by a set of scriptural mechanisms outside of ourselves. And they're basically Markov processes. That's, you know, that's what Freud, that's what Lacan's arguing at the time. So, to kind of move this towards the conclusion. So in this account, the subject is no longer about psychological depth, whether you're looking at Verboes or Wiener or even for that matter, the 1895 Freud, definitely not about subjective depth or the fullness of the cogito. It's something much more like a token in a stochastic chain. This is what I'm saying. This is the history of the tokenization of the psyche, in which Freud is at one end and large language models are at the other. It's not a speculative history. This is, I think, the real empirical history, where you understand how these terms develop and how they became sort of a particular Kroschker's problem solving. And this is part of the broader, non-anthropocentric notions of circuits of language that go beyond the self. The short circuit of a symptom is redefined as coding errors in feedback loops, a failure of the signal to properly integrate a particular investment of energies. And we see that this underpins modern large language models. So, you know, when we're looking at something like a large language model, it's emerging out of a kind of subterranean history of the Freudian drive. We're training problem solving, whether it's for a machine or whether it's treating an analyst or an analyst on. It's partly about dealing with the friction of the real, where error kind of indicates some kind of inability to adapt. Right? So, and just to kind of make a Geoghegana reference here. So there's actually this extraordinary lecture on YouTube by where she asks, our language models are unconscious. And she discusses how and why, if we understand the unconscious as this huge distributed system, is the language model today our unconscious embodiment? She has her own answer to that. I'll leave it to you. I think the analysis is extremely on point, but it's not because psychoanalysis has some extreme, unusual insight into mental illness or into language. It's because psychoanalysis provides the diagram for how these machines are built. Right? So the question is not to me, is this the unconscious in the machine? Right? The question is, are these the machines we want to build? Right? Based on what this model gives us, is this the right kind of machine? Because presumably we can also build other types of machines. And then I also think, this is why I say that the legacy of Lacanianism is in large language models today. I think if one wants to understand the stakes of psychoanalysis, one does not do poorly to look at language models as a way of understanding what the implementation of these models might indicate. For me, they're actually very interesting experimental points of reference. So, I'll close on just one note, so this is not a complete parody of Lacan. The key point, of course, is Lacan does not say we come to exist in and through the symbolic. The symbolic chiefly is defined by its gaps, right? And the fact that the gaps can never be resolved. A language model, when it encounters gaps, as we discussed, produces hallucinations. Okay? Because for a language model, there is no gap, there is no real, there is no outside. If the answer is not within the data set, it has to invent the data. You know, so by any stretch, a kind of pathological response. For Lacan, the subject, this is something Zupančić talks about, the subject emerges more or less in the gaps. And part of, if you look at in the course of the late 60s and 70s, Lacan increasingly turns towards mapping different types of discourses. So for example, he mentions the discourse of the university, which he more or less defines as an effort to develop expert, technocratic knowledge that's measured and masterly, and it's kind of answers to the command of something like reason. And for Lacan, the point is, not all chains of signifiers, not all stochastic relays are the same. There is some organizing logic behind it. And in that context, if you go to Lacan's writing in the period, he had this extraordinary unpublished essay. It was written for Le Monde, they refused to publish it, about reforms after May 68. After May 68, in response to student demands, they introduced something called value units, unité de valeur, of coursework. Every single class has a certain sort of portable, quantified value. study. You can move credits across programs, across universities. You have a fluid exchange value to well-quantified systems of knowledge, which in turn is also supposed to make it easier to get a job. Because you can say, I learned this. I have this quantity and that quantity and that quantity of value units. And for Lacan, this is far worse than the university discourse. He says rather correctly that it takes something like knowledge and it reduces it to standardized quantified elements. What I'm suggesting here are effectively tokens that can proceed in a certain series, that can be reorganized in certain ways. And what it attempts to try to do is kind of remap, according to Lacan, questions of knowledge, questions of language, questions of interaction, the life of the mind, into stable quantitative values for universal exchange on the marketplace, right? And this is actually a completely logical development from exactly what he's saying about how the symbolic works. The symbolic is this machinic system. His concern is that you have this fabulous new method of kind of formalizing those units, right? For Lacan, this is actually just a drift of the university that's ultimately moving towards well-quantified exchange and more or less predictable answers, right? When you have definite quantitative values to coursework, then you also have definite, in principle, more or less quantifiable outcomes, right? And for him, this is part of a larger transformation of the university and a transformation of modern life. He's mostly talking this. He calls this the sociocracy. It's effectively a description of modern life becoming like a concentration camp. He doesn't mean Nazi concentration camps, he means gulags. And he effectively says this will lead us towards a certain flattening out of the entire purpose of knowledge. Right? To me, in this backdrop, like part of the suggestion of that is that we're creating a system, a logic, a class of learning, such that for future students, it's not necessarily a question of struggling with the gaps and the meanings and the interplay of two determinacies. It's coming up with what's the proper way of organizing the tokens to produce the correct unit of value. What are the measures of those unit of value? In such a context, it does not seem to me particularly, if one sees the proliferation of large language models as complete class assignments, I don't think it's necessarily the fault of the students. I think it's the response to the emergence of the system, which Lacan was trying to describe in the 1970s, as actually being, in the end, quite opposite of the spirit of psychoanalysis. So in the end, I would just say, the point is not to say Lacan's a technocrat. He was, but that's not the point. The point is actually to say, it's a certain discussion. The question is not, how do we keep students from using large language models? The question is, how do we organize educational systems that don't find their natural answers in language models, right? And that's part of what Lacan also helps us discover. Thank you.